Montana Territory, July 1882. The sky cracked open with thunder as Hunter Sallow rode hard through the pine-covered ridge above the Bitterroot Valley, his rifle slung across his back, his coat soaked through. His horse kicked up mud with every stride. He had been tracking cattle thieves for 3 days and was down to 1 canteen and half a pouch of jerky. But what stopped him cold wasn't rustlers. It was the sight of a woman in white stumbling barefoot through the trees, soaked, shivering, and smeared with blood. She turned when she heard him, eyes wide and frightened like a deer's. Her dress fine lace and satin hung in tatters. Her veil was torn off and clutched in her hand like a lifeline. She looked like she had walked out of a wedding and straight into a nightmare. Hunter dismounted slow, careful not to startle her. "Ma'am," he said, voice low but firm, "I am not here to hurt you." She opened her mouth but no words came. Her lips trembled. She looked at her hands like she wasn't sure they belonged to her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, stepping closer. "Do you know where you are?" She blinked at him. I do not know my name." Hunter's chest tightened. He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. Her skin was ice cold. "We need to get you out of this rain," he said gently. "My horse will carry us both." "Can you hold on?" She nodded, dazed. He lifted her into the saddle and climbed up behind her, wrapping an arm around her waist to keep her steady. They rode through the downpour toward his cabin, a half-day east. She leaned back against him like she had no strength left. He could feel her heart racing through her ribs. By the time they reached his land, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. His cabin sat snug under a stand of tall firs, smoke curling from the chimney. He brought the horse to a stop and carried her inside. "Sit by the fire," he said. "I will bring dry clothes." She sat on the hearth, staring into the flames like they might tell her who she was. Hunter found a flannel shirt and a pair of wool trousers that would do. She dressed in silence behind the privacy screen, then curled up on the cot, eyes fluttering closed before he could ask another question. He covered her with a quilt and sat in the chair beside her, watching the rise and fall of her breath. She did not wake until morning. When she opened her eyes, she looked around like she had never seen the world before. Hunter handed her a tin cup of coffee. Her hands shook as she took it. "I found you in the woods," he said. "You were alone. Looked like you had run from something bad." She nodded slowly. I remember voices. Men shouting, gunfire, then nothing, just trees." She looked down at her hands. "I do not remember my name." Hunter leaned forward. "Do you remember anyone, family, where you were headed?" She shook her head. "Well," he said, "until you remember, I will call you something." "You all right with that?" She hesitated, then nodded. He looked at her a long moment. "You look like a Violet to me." She smiled faintly. "Violet. Violet Bennett," he added. She blinked. "Why Bennett?" "Because if you need a name, I will give you mine." Her eyes softened. "Your name is Bennett, Sallow, Hunter Sallow, but I had a sister named Bennett. She died young. Thought it might be good luck." Violet held the cup tight. "Thank you." Hunter kept his distance that day, working the woodpile and checking the traps, but his mind stayed on her. She watched him from the porch, quiet, alert, like a hawk that had been caged too long. That night, after stew and silence, she asked, "Why did you help me?" He looked at her across the table. "Because you were alone and scared, and no one should be left like that." A tear slid down her cheek. She wiped it fast, embarrassed. Hunter reached across and touched her hand. Warm, steady. The next days passed slow and careful. Violet helped with chores, though she flinched at sudden sounds. She did not complain. She listened. She watched the fire like it whispered things she could almost remember. One morning, he caught her staring into the mirror, pressing her fingers to her face like she was mapping it. "I do not even know if I was married," she said softly. Hunter set down the feed sack. "You were wearing a wedding dress, but you had no ring." She looked at him. What if someone is looking for me? Then we will find out, he said. But until then, you are safe. She stepped closer. You gave me your name. I did, he said. Why? He looked down. Because I needed one to give you, and I wanted it to mean something. Her breath caught. You do not even know me. I know enough, he said. I know how you looked when you saw the fire. Like it was the first warm thing in a long time. I know you wake up afraid. I know you are strong. She stepped closer again, just inches from him now. What if I never remember? Hunter looked into her eyes. Then we build something new. Her lips parted, but she said nothing. Just reached up, touched his face, then stepped away like she had not meant to. That night, as she slept, he sat at the table carving wood. He had carved names before. Graves, headboards, brands. That night he carved hers, Violet Bennett, and he waited. The autumn sun rose late in the Bitterroot, casting long shadows over the valley and lighting the silver frost that clung to the grass. Violet stood at the fence line with her hands wrapped around a tin mug. She had taken to rising before Hunter, walking the edge of the pasture in his old boots, quiet and watchful. The goats nosed at her hem, and she spoke to them in a voice so low it was nearly carried off by the wind. Hunter stepped out with a kerosene lamp still burning in one hand, watching her from the porch. He didn't call out. He'd learned she came back in her own time. That morning, when she returned, she handed him a folded note. I found this stuck in the lining of the dress, she said. It was sewn into the seam at the waist. Hunter unfolded it carefully. The paper was creased and water-stained. The ink had blurred in places, but a few lines remained legible, part of a name. Abeth W. and a location. Rison, Missouri. He turned it over. Could be part of a letter. Or a calling card, maybe the dressmaker's mark. I thought maybe I had sewn it in myself, she said, eyes fixed on the firewood stacked beside the hearth. To remember who I was. Hunter set the note on the table. Warrensburg's a long ride east. If that's what you want, I'll take you there. She didn't answer right away. Then, I want to know, but I'm afraid of what I'll find, he nodded. That's fair. Later, while she kneaded dough for the biscuits, he brought out the map from the chest beneath the bed. She leaned over it beside him, her hand resting briefly over his as she traced the worn trail lines eastward. If we left after the first snow melts, she said, would we make it before the rivers rise? He looked at her, not the map. We'd have to ride hard, but yes. It gives me time, she said, voice soft, to be sure. That night, she sat by the window instead of the fire. Hunter had left the shutters open so she could see the stars. She pressed her fingers against the glass like she was trying to feel the cold without letting it in. He brought her a blanket and sat across from her, boots crossed at the ankle. You ever miss Texas? She asked. He shook his head. Not the land, just my brother. She tilted her head. Older or younger? Older by 2 years. He taught me to ride, break a horse, fire a shot without blinking. What happened to him? Yellow fever took him in Galveston. Same year I came here. She looked down. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. She didn't speak for a while. Then, I think I had a sister. Hunter waited. I can't see her face, but I remember her laugh. It was sharp like a bell rung too hard. You think she'd miss you? I hope so. She looked at him. Would you? He didn't look away. I already would. Her eyes lowered. Sometimes I think I'm not someone worth missing. You're wrong. Her hands tightened in her lap. What if I'm someone neither of us would like? He leaned forward. I don't believe it. You don't know that. I know who you've been here, he said. And that's enough for me. She didn't answer. But she reached out, laid her hand over his for just a moment, then pulled it back as if she needed to breathe again. In the following days, they moved together through the rhythm of late fall. He taught her to split kindling with a single stroke. She patched the sleeves on his shirts with thread so fine the seams vanished. They spoke little while working, but something passed between them in the silence, steady and warm, like coals banked overnight. One evening, Violet brought in a bundle of yarrow and wild sage she'd gathered along the creek. She laid them out on the table, fingers brushing the leaves with quiet care. "My hands remember more than I do," she said. "These were for healing." Hunter nodded, watching her. "You think you were a nurse, maybe, or someone's helper. Maybe you were your own." She gave him a look that held more gratitude than she could say. That night, the wind blew in colder, driving the first flurries of snow against the windows. Hunter stoked the fire and stood behind her as she watched the flakes drift in the lantern light. "I'll sleep here tonight," she said, nodding toward the cot near the hearth. "Your bed's closer to the draft." "You're not made of glass," he said. "No," she replied, "but you've given me enough. Let me give something back." He didn't argue, just nodded and handed her the quilt folded on the chair. As she lay down, she looked up at him. "Hunter?" "Yeah. Do you think names matter as much as what we do with them?" "I think what we do with them is what makes them matter." She smiled, then small, tired but real. He watched her until her breathing slowed and the fire sank low. Then he turned out the lamp, sat by the window, and waited for morning. The snow held through November, layering thick along the firs and softening the world around Hunter's cabin into silence. The nearby creek slowed to a crawl beneath ice, and the mountains wore their white coats like old kings. Inside, the hearth burned steady, and Violet had taken to reading from a worn book of sermons Hunter's mother had left behind years ago. She didn't speak them aloud, just traced the words with her fingertip and tilted her head as if listening for something lost. One morning, Hunter found her in the barn, brushing down the mule he rarely used. Her sleeves were rolled, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and she moved with a quiet purpose that made something in him still. "You aiming to ride somewhere?" he asked, stepping over the hay scattered across the floorboards. "No," she said, brushing behind the mule's ears. He was restless, figured he needed a task. "He's not used to gentleness." "Neither am I," she said, not looking up. Hunter leaned against the stall, watching her work. "You hold peace like you earned it." She set the brush down. "It doesn't stay long unless you keep it fed." Later that week, she unearthed a small iron kettle from beneath the floorboards in the pantry. "Why was this buried?" she asked, wiping dust from the lid. "Belonged to my father," Hunter said, setting down the bag of flour he'd brought in from the shed. "He used it when he traveled, said the fire tasted different in an open pot." "Did he teach you to cook?" "No," Hunter said. He wasn't the teaching kind. She filled it with snow and set it over the fire. "Then who did?" He hesitated. "A woman I knew in Texas, short time. She kept chickens and hated silence." Violet nodded, letting that settle. "Did you love her?" "I thought I did," he said. "Back then, I mistook wanting for knowing." She stirred the snow as it melted. "And now, I know better." She didn't answer, but her back stayed turned and her hands moved steady along the rim of the kettle. That night, after supper, she asked him to teach her his mother's way of stringing dried apples. She sat at the table with a needle and twine, her brow creased in concentration. When she pricked her finger on the third slice, she hissed and pressed it to her mouth. "You all right?" Hunter asked, reaching for her hand. She let him take it, her palm open like a question. "It's nothing." He wrapped the fingertip in a strip of cloth from his shirt cuff. "Still worth tending." She watched him tie the knot. "You move careful. Like you've learned how not to break things." "I've broken enough," he said. They stayed like that a moment longer than necessary. Then she eased her hand back and returned to the apples. The next morning, a rider came up the ridge, an older man on a chestnut gelding, coat worn to the threads. Hunter met him halfway to the porch, rifle resting in the crook of his arm. "James Tiller," the man said, "postmaster out of Missoula. "You're Hunter Sallow." "That's right." "Got a letter addressed to a Violet W." He stopped, eyeing the woman who had just stepped into the doorway. Violet froze, one hand on the frame. "May I see it?" Tiller handed it over. "Came through a week ago, marked urgent." She opened it slow, fingers stiff. Her eyes moved across the page, then again. She folded it and held it to her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly and stepped back inside. Hunter waited until Tiller rode off before following her in. She stood by the window, the letter still pressed flat against her. "You remember anything?" he asked. She nodded once. "My name is Violet Whitmore." He stayed quiet. "My sister's name is Clara. She's alive. She's been searching since August." "Where is she now?" "Independence. She wrote from a boarding house. She thought I was dead." Her voice caught, but she steadied it. "She's all I have left." Hunter reached for the back of a chair but didn't sit. "Do you want to go to her?" "I do," she said. "But not yet." He met her eyes. "Why not?" She looked at him, calm but certain. "Because I am Violet Whitmore, but I'm also Violet Bennett now, and if I go to her, I want to go knowing who I've become." Hunter stepped closer. "You've got time." She smiled then, a slow one, different than before. "I'd like to use it here," he nodded. "Then we will." That night she reached for his hand by the fire. This time she didn't let go. By mid-December, the days had narrowed to pale hours and long blue dusks. Violet had taken to lighting the oil lamp just before the sun disappeared, not to chase the darkness, but to hold it gently at the edges. Hunter noticed how she moved through the cabin now, not as someone sheltered, but as someone settling. Her touch lingered on things. The brush beside the wash basin, the ladle hung on the nail by the stove, the pair of gloves she'd stitched from an old coat sleeve and lined with rabbit fur. That morning, she stood by the window, watching a pair of elk crossing the far ridge. Their breath rose in clouds, and she pressed her fingers to the glass not in wonder, but recognition. "You've been quiet," Hunter said, drawing on his boots by the door. "I was thinking about Clara," she said. "She wrote that she's working at a dry goods shop now. She said the owner lets her leave the lantern burning all night if she has trouble sleeping." "You plan to write her back?" "I will," Violet said, "but not today." She turned from the window. "I've been dreaming again." Hunter straightened, his coat half in his hands. "You remember something?" "Not from before," she said. "But in the dreams I'm here. In this room, the fire's low and you're reading by it. I'm sewing something. Neither of us speaks." He waited, letting her find the words. "But it's not frightening," she said. "It feels finished. Like nothing's missing." Hunter nodded once, pulling the coat over his shoulders. "I'll be back before dark. The snare line near the ravine needs clearing." After he left, Violet set to boiling soap scraps, stirring the pot with a long pine stick. She'd read once that ash could be used in place of lye, and she meant to try it. Her hands moved without hurry, and her mind wandered to the letter tucked between the pages of the sermon book. She hadn't opened it again. Not out of fear, but because, for once, the present felt more solid than whatever came before. By late afternoon, the snow deepened, pale and dry as sifted flour. Hunter returned with 2 rabbits and a shallow cut across his forearm. Violet met him at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. "You didn't mention there were wolves out past the ravine," he said, setting the carcasses on the bench outside. "I didn't know. They're tracking the deer. I laid new snares farther up. Should keep them busy." She stepped closer and caught sight of the blood. "Let me see." "It's nothing. You're bleeding through your coat." He let her guide him to the chair by the fire. She unwrapped his scarf and rolled up the sleeve, revealing the gash. It wasn't deep, but it was long and ragged. "This will need stitching," she said, already reaching for the sewing tin. Hunter watched her thread the needle. "You've done this before." "I think so," she said. "My hands remember more than I do." She worked in quiet focus, her brow drawn, lips pressed together. When she tied off the last knot, she looked up at him. "Does it hurt?" He shook his head. "Not from you." She didn't pull away. "You've waited a long time. I would have waited longer." Something shifted, then, unspoken but certain. Violet rested her hand over the stitched cloth. "I don't know how to say it without sounding like I'm missing pieces." "Don't say it," he said. "Just stay." "I want to," she whispered. That night she didn't sleep on the cot. After the fire burned low and the coals glowed soft in the hearth, she crossed the room in silence and lay down beside him. She didn't ask for space, and he didn't offer distance. He simply took her hand beneath the quilt and held it there, steady and sure. The wind moved through the trees outside and touched the cabin walls with a sound like breath. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. By morning, the world outside was buried in snow, but inside the cabin, nothing had ever felt more certain. The snow held through January, layering the world in a hush so complete even the trees seemed to breathe slower. Hunter had built a second woodpile near the porch, and Violet had taken to placing pine cones along the windowsills to keep the mice from creeping inside. Each day was shaped by the small but steady work of winter survival: mending, hauling, chopping, tending. But beneath that rhythm, something more deliberate had begun to grow between them, not spoken, not hurried, only steadied by time and by trust. One afternoon, a wagon creaked up the slope toward the cabin. It was drawn by a pair of roans and driven by a woman wrapped in a green shawl, her mouth pressed tight against the cold. Hunter stepped out first, his rifle nowhere in sight, and Violet followed behind, wiping her hands on her apron. The woman climbed down before the wagon had fully stopped. "You Hunter Sallow?" "I am," he said. "You come far?" "From Helena," she said, brushing snow from her sleeves. "Name's Ruth Ellis. I run the telegraph office there and keep a parcel ledger on the side. This came in weeks back with your name scratched on the corner." She reached into the bed of the wagon and pulled out a cedar box, its corners bound in brass. "Marked private, no return." Violet stepped forward slowly. "May I?" Ruth handed it to her. "It's heavy." "Didn't rattle any." Violet turned the box in her hands, then looked up at Hunter. "It's mine." Ruth nodded once and climbed back into the seat. "I'd stay for coffee, but I've 2 more turns to make before nightfall. Snow's worse down the gulch." Hunter tipped his hat. "Safe travels." When they were alone again, Violet carried the box inside. She set it on the table and opened the latches. Inside lay a folded ribbon, a silver thimble, a daguerreotype wrapped in muslin, and a small, leather-bound journal. She lifted the photograph first. A woman stood beside a tree, sunlight catching the edge of her braid. Her features were sharp, familiar. "That's Clara," she whispered, "and that's me beside her." Hunter stepped beside her. "I remember the day we took it," she said. "We'd just finished baking for the harvest fair. I burned the first batch, and she teased me the whole way to the photographer's cart." She set the photo down and opened the journal. The first page held only a name, Violet Whitmore, of Carver's Hollow. She ran her fingers across the letters. "I didn't think I'd get anything back. But here it is." Hunter rested a hand on her shoulder. "You know where you're from now?" "I do," she said, "but I also know where I'm going." That evening, after the lamp was lit and supper cleared, Violet stood by the hearth, the daguerreotype tucked into her apron pocket. Hunter sat in the rocking chair, sharpening a knife against the whetstone with slow, even strokes. "I want to write Clara tomorrow," Violet said. "Tell her I'm safe. Tell her what I've remembered." Hunter looked up. "You'll want to go to her. I'll ask her to come here." He set the knife down. "You sure?" "I thought I needed to go back," she said, "but I don't. I just needed to know who I was before. Now I do, and now I know what I want." She stepped toward him and took his hands in hers. "I want to stay, Not because I can't go, but because I choose to." Hunter didn't speak. He only rose and drew her close, resting his forehead against hers. The fire snapped in the hearth behind them, and outside the wind moved gently through the trees. "I never asked," he said quietly. "But what was your favorite part of that photograph?" She smiled. "The way Clara was laughing. And the way I was looking at her like I knew everything would be all right." She looked up at him. "And I was right." February came with clearer skies, and Clara arrived on a hired sleigh just before dusk one evening. She stepped down into the snow with a look that carried grief, hope, and disbelief all at once. Violet met her halfway, arms out, tears already streaking her cheeks. They held one another for a long while without a word. Clara was shorter, her coat too thin for the cold, but her grip was strong. "I didn't think I'd find you again," Clara said, voice thick. "I didn't think I'd be found," Violet said. They had already prepared a room for her, a cot in the corner with a quilt Violet had pieced together from old shirts and wool scraps. That night, they ate together by lamplight, and Clara listened as Violet told the story of her days since the woods, of the slow remembering, and of the man who had made space for her to become herself again. When Clara had gone to sleep, Hunter stepped out onto the porch. Violet followed, wrapping her shawl tight. "She'll stay through the thaw," Violet said, "but she'll return to Independence after. She belongs to that town." "And you," Violet turned to him, "I belong here if you'll have me." He didn't answer with words. He reached into his coat and pulled out a simple ring, carved from antler and polished smooth. "I've been working at it nights," he said. "Didn't know if I'd ever get the chance." She reached for it with trembling fingers. He slid it onto her hand. The wind moved soft through the trees, and the stars came out one by one. By spring, the wedding was held in the meadow beyond the pasture. Clara stood beside Violet, holding a bouquet of sage and lavender. Ruth Ellis came back from Helena just to witness it. The ceremony was quiet, spoken under a sky of soft blue and birdsong. Afterward, they shared a meal in the open air, and the sun stayed late in the sky, as if it, too, didn't want to miss a moment. Years passed. Violet planted a garden that bloomed with root vegetables and wildflowers. She kept bees and taught the neighbor children to stitch. Hunter built a second room off the cabin, then a third. They worked side by side each season, and in the evenings they sat on the porch, her head against his shoulder, his hand resting over hers. They never left the Bitterroot because everything they needed had found them there, and on quiet nights, when the wind moved through the trees just right, Violet would lean close and say, "I remember now." And Hunter would answer, "So do I."